Before 28 Days Later, there were plenty of movies which turned humans into monsters, but none did it quite like this movie. Here, the infected are not rotting corpses who shamble slowly toward their victims. These infected are fast, vicious, and loud. Even one could be formidable, let alone a horde of them. Alex Garland's screenplay captures it perfectly on page 4. Like a bullet from a gun, the infected chimp leaps out at the female activist and sinks its teeth into her neck. Like a bullet from a gun tells you everything about their rage-fueled movement, the ferocity, speed, and sound. The movie also has a real, gritty feel. Portions were shot on small digital cameras. In part, it was a necessity. When you close main roads in London to make the city look abandoned, you can only hold traffic for minutes at a time, so the cameras had to be maneuverable. They had to be quick to start and stop, something more cumbersome with traditional film cameras. Camera choice was part artistic and part practical, but it all adds up to a certain feel, like we're watching a combination of home video and CCTV footage, rather than a movie, which goes a step further in tricking your mind into believing in the story. This movie even avoids opening credits or a title card. When 28 Days Later appears on screen, it's not as a title, but as a descriptor. That's how long after activists freed the rage-infected chimps that Jim wakes from his coma. And when the movie shows empty streets or atrocities, it borrows from true events to stay within the bounds of reality. Jim picking up money from empty streets is based on photographs of Cambodia after Pol Pot was driven out of Phnom Penh. Money was left in the streets because it was useless at that point. The board covered in notes and photos of missing people is taken from the aftermath of an earthquake in Beijing, where normal lines of communication were closed. The church filled with bodies is taken from atrocities in Rwanda, where a church could become the site of a mass killing and turned into a makeshift mortuary. Even the moment where Jim, Selena, and Mark survive the gas station explosion by hiding in the wall space between windows is based on a photograph from Northern Ireland. On the DVD commentary, director Danny Boyle describes seeing one where people escaped a bomb blast by doing exactly that. Garland and Boyle filled the movie with these images as an attempt to ground it in reality and to say something about rage. At the same time the movie feels real, it also feels surreal, as it would to suddenly wake up in the apocalypse. The plot device of Jim waking from a coma gives us a protagonist who shares our frame of reference. We discover this post-apocalyptic reality at the same pace he does, and it would feel surreal, like a violation of what you expect to wake up to every day. Some of that surrealism is achieved by stretching the truth. For example, London feels a lot more empty when it's completely devoid of people, living or dead. It's a stretch because in this scenario, of course the streets would be filled with bodies, but they made a choice to keep them empty. This clash of expectations is used throughout the movie to sustain that surreal feeling, like hearing Frosty the Snowman when they enter Frank and Hannah's apartment, seeing the entire city of Manchester in flames, or the upbeat music during their shopping spree, itself a surreal experience. How likely is it they'd find an untouched, unlooted store filled with everything they need in the midst of this apocalyptic wasteland? It's like a fantasy, and maybe it is. Because in the prior scene, it seems they've driven through a painting to find this store. Look at the flower bed they drive by on the way there, altered to look like they were drawn by Van Gogh. And there's the later dinner party scene. The soldiers are joined by a grieving, quiet Hannah along with Jim and Selena in the midst of a brutal journey. But the soldiers play at normalcy around the dinner table. It's inspired by a similar scene from Apocalypse Now, and Garland uses the word surreal twice to describe it in the screenplay. Interior mansion, dining room, night. A surreal scene. Dinner with full silver service, candles, wine in crystal glasses, napkins, and everyone rather formally sitting while Jones lays food on the table, wearing an apron over his uniform, made all the more surreal by Jim and Selina's grubby clothes and Hannah's dazed, tear-streaked face. It may seem counterintuitive to use the word surreal while talking about how grounded the movie feels, but sometimes reality feels different. If you've ever been in a bad accident or experienced some unexpected tragedy, it may have had a dreamlike or maybe nightmare-like quality to it. That phrase we've all thought, even if we didn't say it out loud. This can't be happening.
And then I wake up today in hospital. I wake up and I'm hallucinating or I'm...
But even if life has become a living nightmare, 28 Days Later never becomes gratuitous with its horror. It never devolves into unrelenting darkness or nihilism. Instead, it has a beating heart at the center of it, Selina rediscovering a sense of meaning, and maybe even love. 28 Days Later also takes its time to mourn everything that's been lost. Think of the scene where Jim finds his parents. A sad scene on its own, but even more haunting thanks to the hymn which plays over it, Abide With Me. Another hymn, Ave Maria, is used in a later scene, when they decide on leaving for the military blockade. Both punctuate dramatic scenes which explore two sides of the same theme: family. In one case losing it, Jim's parents, and in the other, celebrating the start of a new one, Jim and Selina joining Frank and Hannah. Using well-known, religiously oriented music from the 1800s adds gravity, makes the sequences appropriately haunting, and as Boyle describes on the commentary, it conjures thoughts of history and culture, both wiped out by the virus. But there is some hope. When the soldiers take Jim captive, one of them rants about quarantine. When he's taken to the execution grounds, Jim sees something in the sky that proves it. An airplane. The world hasn't ended. And after another 28 days pass, the infected begin to starve. Will Jim, Hannah, and Selina ever reach the uninfected, still thriving world? It's uncertain, but what is certain is that Jim, Selina, and Hannah have come together into a makeshift family. Selina thought survival was the greatest aim she could hope for, but meeting Frank and Hannah taught her otherwise.
I was thinking I was wrong.
But what?
All the death, all the shit. It doesn't really mean anything to Frank and Hannah because, well, she's got a dad and he's got his daughter, so... I was wrong when I said that staying alive is as good as it gets.
Now with Jim and Hannah, she is doing more than surviving, and she is making plans for a better future, even helping with a big hello sign for the next flyover. This movie's grungy feel, the ferocity of the infected, and the emotional core at the center of it make it stand out among so many apocalyptic tales. But the idea which drew Danny Boyle to Alex Garland's screenplay was rage. From Garland speaking with Filmmaker magazine, Danny was particularly interested in issues that had to do with social rage, the increase of rage in our society, road rage, and other things. There are exactly 0 zombies in 28 Days Later, but in its basic premise is something similar to zombie movies, large populations turned into hordes of monsters. And like the Night, Dawn, and Day of the Dead films which Garland cites as influences on this movie, the zombies or monsters are meant to represent us, or at least some aspect of us, like our rampant consumerism in Dawn of the Dead, where even reanimated corpses are drawn to the shopping mall. But in 28 Days Later, the connection is more than metaphorical. It's part of the story. In the same Filmmaker magazine interview, Boyle referred to the infection as a psychological virus. This differentiates it from the zombie genre, where people become something unnatural, monsters who feed on living flesh. This insatiable and bizarre appetite is something new that replaces human nature. But in 28 Days Later, nothing new is added to human nature. Instead, people become more of something they already are. Everyone has rage inside them. This infection simply amplifies it. and turns off everything else. But Garland specifically referred to social rage, like it's more than just an emotion, but something that boils up as a societal phenomenon. And the movie primes you to think of this because it opens with footage of what happens when rage boils over. The footage is inspired by real footage of the Sierra Leone Civil War, taken by Surreal Samara, a brave journalist who put himself in the middle of war to capture raw footage and show the world what's really happening, most notably in the documentary Cry Freetown. Boyle mentions they debated using actual footage, but ultimately decided it would be better to mock something up rather than depict real violence. The clips that open the movie are fast and chaotic. It's hard to pin down exactly what you're seeing, but it clearly alludes to social unrest, violence, and death. But it does not appear to be targeted in a calculated way, but instead driven by frenzied emotion. The Sierra Leone Civil War was filled with some of the worst, inhumane atrocities you can imagine. They are indescribably disturbing, and I won't describe them here, other than to say a rational person can find legitimate grievances which sparked that war, but it ultimately led to monstrous actions, where no adjectives exist to adequately describe their awfulness. It's similar to what I discussed in my video on Castlevania Nocturne concerning the French Revolution. There may have been just cause for revolution, but clearly there were many who fought, not only for a higher cause, but also to indulge in their rage. Little else can explain the wanton disemboweling and slaughter. This is the specific kind of rage those opening images conjure. When hate, no matter how justified, boils over, it can turn into a social rage, which becomes an incredible force of violence. These opening clips don't just allude to these ideas, they essentially are the infection. We see these clips are being screened for a chimp strapped to a chair, and the scientist says he's been infected with rage. In a literal sense, the scientists have taken our social rage captured in footage and stuck it into these apes. Why? The scientist says, in order to cure, you must first understand. And the screenplay makes it even more explicit, adding the lines, just imagine, to have power over all the things we feel we can't control, anger, violence. It seems their goal is to cure a population of rage, which itself is a frightening proposition. There are plenty of times in history where perhaps revolution was a just cause, and it's hard to imagine it succeeding without some strong emotions. Pamphlets, essays, and logical arguments might lay the groundwork, but without rallying cries like, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." It's hard to imagine sparks turning into the raging inferno needed for revolution, and if the government finds its cure for rage, those sparks will amount to nothing. Instead, emotions will be tempered and populations pacified. So it seems rage has some utility. On the other hand, too much leads to unnecessary death and destruction. Just look at examples throughout history, some of which have been captured on film and poured into these chimps. And as the infection spreads, we see what pure rage does to a society. There are many ways civil unrest comes about, but one that's often to blame is the failings and injustices of those in power. 28 Days Later is in part, of course, about the fear of highly deadly, highly contagious disease. At the time this movie was made, there were a couple of major cases fresh in mind. An outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the UK saw over 6 million cows and sheep killed in order to stop it. And although it never spread to people, some do, like the Nipah virus in '98. 1 million pigs were killed to stop the outbreak, but not before 108 people were killed by it. But 28 Days Later goes a step further to zero in on a particular kind of virus, one that is engineered. It's a cautionary tale to apply science responsibly, and it touches on a distrust toward those in power. Not only might the scientists, government, and military woefully fail to protect us against an outbreak, but they might be responsible for it in the first place. They may tout their goals as noble. To cure rage, they must first understand it. Even if true, it's a risk they've taken on society's behalf without permission, and it reeks of self-preservation, a way for those in power to hold on to power by protecting us from ourselves, by ensuring we never get too upset and never find the energy needed to take their power away. This movie really was ahead of its time in some ways. Kind of feels like a good time for a sequel. Oh, cool. Wait a minute. Zombie films? What zombies? The distrust of those we expect to protect us starts in the opening frames, when we learn about the rage virus they created. It's animal activists who inadvertently let it loose, but the risk only exists thanks to the scientists and those who fund their operation. The distrust continues to grow when Jim wakes up to discover they've let the country fall. It nearly reaches a fever pitch when they find the soldiers acting more like overgrown children. As they tour the outpost, the feeling of safety it offers quickly turns into dread. And then, of course, we discover the military outpost's sinister nature. Commanding Officer Henry West plans on forcing Selena and Hannah to satisfy his men, ostensibly with the goal of repopulation, but it feels more like trying to pacify a pack of wild animals, and Jim will be executed for attempting to interfere. Finally, we uncover another failing. The airplane in the sky tells Jim the rest of the world is okay, but has not found a way to help or even communicate, leaving Great Britain quarantined. 28 days later encourages a skepticism of science pushing research too far or in the wrong direction, governments failing to properly address an emergency, and a military that quickly turns on the people it's supposed to protect. All of that adds up to civil unrest, which, unfettered, turns into rage. In 28 days later, that rage is spread involuntarily through saliva and blood. But even without infection, we don't need to be forced into rage, because the emotion itself is intoxicating. When you feel angry, there's a gravity to that emotion, which makes it almost impossible to escape from. If you're in an argument, you want to disprove your opponent, and the idea of backing down is insane. If you believe you were wronged, you want to see justice done. And when anger turns to rage, you will. Jim woke up alone in a world filled with monsters. Yet somehow he managed to cobble a family together. Then, on the radio, they found hope, a message about the answer to infection. They followed its directions, and it wasn't easy, but they made it. Hannah lost her father, but they made it. And that hope suddenly turned sour. But when they drag Jim to those execution grounds, he shows them what rage really looks like. He shows them how a bicycle courier can take on a platoon of trained soldiers. He sounds the alarm to bring the infected into their compound. He lets the soldiers die. He kills some himself, one with his bare hands. And by the time he turns to Selena, he looks no different than the infected, because he is using the same weapon, rage. The 28 Days Later theme, titled In the House in a Heartbeat, plays over this sequence and perfectly captures what it's all about. I can't play it for you here, but it's easy to find on YouTube, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to music, so give it a listen if you need a reminder. But it starts with an ominous piano, as though warning you that something is coming. A warning because rage can be a terrifying force. As Jim kills his way through the compound, getting covered in blood, looking more and more like the infected, you can feel the rage grow as the piano is overshadowed by other instruments, reaching its peak as Jim digs his thumbs into a man's skull. He turns to Selena and the music is silent. Then it returns quietly, but now it's melancholy and almost romantic. Because unlike the infected, and unlike the social rage that's allowed to boil over into unending violence and atrocities, Jim can't come back from it. When the song reaches its crescendo, it's satisfying, like winning an argument or enacting justice. It feels good. When there is a cause that tugs at our most primal feelings of morality and justice, the rage is intoxicating, but you have to be able to come back from it. How? Maybe it helps to have something like the opposite of rage. Instead of the intense desire to see something destroyed, the intense desire to hold on to something and protect it. Love. The thing Selena discovered when she realized Hannah and Frank were okay because they had each other. Familial love. And with Jim, maybe she can have a romantic love. To survive this world, she had to become a monster.
Look, if someone gets infected, you've got between 10 and 20 seconds to kill them. It might be your brother or your sister or your oldest friend. It makes no difference. And just so you know where you stand, if it happens to you, I'll do it in a heartbeat.
But after discovering there is more than just survival, she breaks that rule. When Jim comes to her after killing the soldiers, she hesitates.
That was longer than a heartbeat.
And she brings Jim back too. It's easy to imagine a world where he doesn't have Selena or Hannah and is forced to kill for survival, and it's easy to imagine how that could turn him into a monster, like some of those soldiers. If you listen to Selena earlier in the movie, ready to kill a brother, sister, or oldest friend, she isn't wrong. If someone is 15 seconds away from turning into a creature who will kill you, of course it's necessary to stop them, just as Major Henry West isn't entirely wrong when he gives a speech about people killing people, how that's what he's seen in the 4 weeks since infection, and it's no different from what he saw the 4 weeks before infection, and the 4 weeks before that.
That as far back as I care to remember, people killing people, which to my mind puts us in a state of normality right now.
But both their stories are incomplete, and that's what it means to be cynical. It's a worldview corroborated by so much evidence, but only if you ignore the rest. Because the truth is that yes, there is rage, but there is also love. 28 Days Later is thrilling, dark, sad, and at the same time, strangely hopeful. That last part is not something you often see done well in horror, and it's part of what's made this one of my favorite movies. Watching it again today, it also amazes me to see how relevant it is. Alex Garland is about to release Civil War, which tackles themes including distrust of media and politicians, which feels like a natural extension of some of the distrust on display in this movie. And of course, there's the announcement of 28 years later. Given the additional announcement that it may be the first of a new trilogy, it seems Garland and Boyle see these themes as at least 3 times as relevant 22 years later after 28 Days Later, and I'm sure they'll have some new ideas to explore through the story as well. And yes, I am aware of 28 Weeks Later, but given Boyle and Garland's limited involvement in that movie, it never felt like a true successor to me. But just for fun, I might revisit it before the true sequels arrive, so let me know if you're interested in seeing that. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more. With that, thank you for watching, and see you on the next One Take.